All right. For those of you that are Zoomies and for those of you that are in person, this is a student-led review. So we've been doing practice examples, for since, the beginning of class. And now it's time for you guys to have a chance to ask any specific clarification. So to me, the easiest way is what I just put on the board. Like, we're not here for you to ask, hey, can you do some hip examples? Can you do some? But we are here if you give us a specific example or if you have specific clarification questions. Like in a previous lecture, you guys did this, and I wasn't quite sure what that meant. That's what today is about. It's about fine tuning. It's just making sure that you don't have any clarification questions. Today is not meant to start from the beginning, but just meant to fine tune to make sure you guys have all your I's dotted and T's crossed. So, does anybody, whether you are virtual on Zoom or if you are face to face through Emma and Grace, I did not mean that to rhyme. Who wants to break the ice?
Yeah, what's up, buddy?
So are we gonna have anything with the biceps or short head, or but we've just seen stuff with the ball?
So what a great question. So it's almost as if the bicep femoris short head obviously does exist. I mean, you could strain it, you could have a nerve problem with it, but the biceps femoris long and short head are kind of sister muscles at the knee, meaning they have to work together at the knee because they blend into the same rope. They blend into the same tendon. So think of it like this. I can isolate the long head at the hip, but I can't just isolate the short head at the knee. So that's why you won't see just short head for knee. You'll have biceps femoris because that infers both long and short pulling at the knee. So it's like I can have long head work by itself, but I cannot have short head work by itself. Does that make sense?
That answers your question perfectly.
Okay.
Yes. You have a follow-up question?
Not for that.
Okay.
I'm listening with intent.
Yes.
So just to be clear, our problems where we have like muscles on slack, is that only going to be a scenario when muscles are multi-joint? Or I think I asked a question like this before, but it's like, for example, if the popliteus, since it does internal rotation at the knee, but it also does knee flexion. Like,
Yeah, so let me jump in here. All the questions will be multi-articular axial questions. So in other words, you in order to internally rotate for your specific example with the popliteus, potato, pecan, is that in order to internally rotate, you got to flex the knee anyway. But the questions that I'm going to ask are specifically introductory biomechanical questions to see if we can understand how muscles that cross multiple joints have to be viewed on the positions of each of those joints to its length tension. So in other words, if Grace and Emma are pulling with a rope and they have to pull with 50 pounds of force, they are being innervated, activated, called to, asked to pull with 50 pounds of force. And if Emma lets go of her right hand, then the three hands that are on that rope have to pull with more force. So the concept is, and I'm just going to ask major muscles like the rectus femoris, I think is a good example of why do you stretch it? Why does it feel like a bigger or more impactful stretch when you're flexing your knee and you're extending your hip because you're lengthening that muscle on both ends. And so the opposite is true. If I slack a muscle on one end, it's not going to be pulling as much on the other. So that's the example of, and these are all practical examples like seated calf raise. Why does I want my students to be able to go to grad school or go into the clinic or the personal training venue and understand that the reason I'm emphasizing soleus, it's not that all the muscles are turned off. It's not that the gastroc's turned off, but the reason that my soleus is pulling a little bit more to do that fixed work, that 50 pounds of work, is because my gastrocnemius in a seated position is on slack. So it's like taking one hand off of the rope. And my other muscles that aren't affected by the position of my knee have to increase their contribution to the work. And so a few major examples of that is the thrusters, the barbell thrusters. I know I'm not saying that word right, but the hip thrusters. Like, why does that emphasize your gluteus maximus? Because your hamstrings are on slack at your knees. Like it's examples like that, practical examples. I'm not going to get into it's holistic, practical example questions that I'm going to ask just to see if we understand that concept of if I slack a muscle at one joint, it's going to effectively not pull as efficiently at the other joint. And I'm going to use big muscles for those example questions.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
I think you had a question.
Yeah, so I was just wondering, like, where it looks like. So she's like using her trunk to hold herself up,
Mhm.
there's also the aspect of like. The transverse plane where she's going like this,
The Russian twist.
yeah, so
Okay.
if there's like two things happening here. Would there be a specification of like which one is being asked or? Both?
No, I'm going to test your ability to guess. I'm just messing with you. Absolutely, there has to be, right? Like I have to make sure that we're on the same page on what I'm asking, and I can do that in three different ways. One is very communicating in the question, but the answers have to kind of match up, right? I mean, if I'm asking you neck stuff and I give you ankle answers, that doesn't really match up. Or I can give the clarification in the answers itself. So in other words, if I say, which muscle, I'm just doing this one because in the view, you can't see my lower extremity. But if I do this and I say, what muscle happened when I do this? And you're like, well, shoulders moving and elbows moving. So that's going to be shoulder muscle and elbow muscles. But all of my answer choices are elbow answers. Then you could say, oh, all right, that he's just saying which there's other muscles, but which of these would be, helping at the elbow. So 100% my job is to communicate what I'm asking, and I do that either through the question, through the answers, or a combination of both. That was the third option. And it's fair. Hey, I'm not perfect. I might made a mistake. I might not have clarified well, or I might just have been, having a brain twist. And so that's fair questions that you guys can ask. I'm going to be available on FaceTime with my wife. And so if you have a clarification question, Grace and Emma might be able to clarify it, but I'll be available to clarify. But my clarification isn't, is this right or left transverse? In other words, my clarification can involve me giving you information. It's just to look at the question and make sure I've given you all the pieces that we have discussed in class for you to be able to look at those answer choices and say which one is the best answer choice. Those are 100% fair questions. I'll clarify those all day.
In the context of subtalar everters and inverters, when they're doing a first class lever scenario where they're just balancing the ankle, would that be considered?
Or balancing the subtalar joint, right?
Yeah, would that be considered? Maybe this is getting way too complicated.
No, you're good.
For myself, but would that be considered like isometric in a way? Because they're
What a great question. No, and it's impossible because there's always going to be sway. Like the only way for it to not move is literally for you to like brace yourself. But the fact that there's sway, like when you're balancing, the fact that your foot constantly does this, that means that it can't be isometric. It can't perfectly be static, right? So there's going to be a constant influx and efflux of concentrics and eccentrics happening there as you balance it. I'm not going to ask that question on the test, but the concept of the inverters and everters working as a first class lever arrangement to help you balance is something I can ask on the test.
Okay, all right, thank you.
You're very welcome. You know what's kind of cool too is if you think about the subtalar as a first class arrangement with the inverters, like a teeter-totter. If I contract my inverters to bring the medial part of my foot up, the lateral part of my foot goes down. You know, reversing up. You know, as you pull one side of the teeter-totter down, the other side goes up. So that's just really cool. But yeah, the kind of question I would ask is: you're balancing on your left foot, and your inverters on the medial side and your everters are on the lateral side are working together, not necessarily at the same time, but they're working together to keep your center of mass over your base of support, to keep your balance. That would be an example of an advantage of which type of lever. And you're just like, I know that one. We've talked about it several times. That's a first. First is great for balance. That's a really good question, like really good insight, really good thought. But I'm just here to tell you that I just would not. I would not ask that straight up.
Anyone have any specific examples that they want us to kind of clarify?
Oh, I want to say something. Don't come inside class. We're gonna Grace and Emma and I are gonna let 310 out a little early on Wednesday. Don't come into class unless you're ready to start writing. So in other words, if you want to study till the last minute, stay outside. The way I thought about appeasing to our extra time for your circles is that when you are ready and you come in, you get your paper and you go sit down and you start writing. I think that was the easiest, cleanest way. And then there's no distraction of, all right, everybody, put your stuff up and people want one paper. So if you want to study till the last minute, no problem. Stay outside. If you're ready to write on your circles or your paper, lists or circles or whatever you want, prayers, I don't care. But when you're ready, you come into the room, you'll get your paper, you sit down, and you can start writing immediately. Is that fair?
How exactly will the question on length and tension, like a question on length and tension relationships look like? If I can't ask that.
Yeah, it would be a practical question. So in other words, again, if I flex my hip, will my rectus femoris have more or less of a contributor as a knee extensor? Or a practical example like we just did with the soleus, right? Where if I'm doing seated calf raises, my soleus will contribute more to the group because my gastroc is on slack. Does that make sense? So it's like the soleus isn't directly affected by knee position, but it's indirectly affected. And we also talked about length tension for stretching, right? Like if you have your knee extended and you're stretching your plantar flexors, your gastrocnemius is probably going to stop your motion sooner than if you slack your knee. I'm sorry, you flex your knee and you put the gastroc on slack, you could get a little bit more dorsiflexion. because you get the gastric out the way as the limit to your range of motion, and then you could stretch other plantar flexors. So it's practical questions like that that will assess if I know that you know the length tension concept.
Thank you.
You're very welcome. Great question. I think Grace and Emma back me up on this. We did the examples of the hamstring several times. If you want to stretch the hamstrings, make sure your knee is locked out, right? Make sure your knee is extended and flex your hip. But if you want to stretch the gluteus maximus, you got to flex your knee. You got to get those hamstrings on slack so that you could get more hip flexion and thus stretch other muscles on the posterior hip. Things that I think you guys have already been introduced to, we're just explaining the whys. That's all we're doing.
Yeah, I think that's where like the circles come in handy too, is like, okay, your circles show you the functions of the muscles, and you know that stretching is just like doing the opposite motion as the function of the muscle.
Mm-hmm.
So have a muscle that crosses at two joints, just like looking at those two circles, looking at their functions, and then the opposite is how they're optimally stretched.
Yeah, absolutely. So like for the gastrocnemius, right? If you truly wanted to stretch the gastrocnemius, you don't just want to dorsiflex. You want to make sure that knee is extended while you dorsiflex. You know, if you were doing a towel stretch and you pulled on your ankle to dorsiflex, if you're trying to hit that gastroc, you want to make sure that knee is extended. That's all we're getting at, is practically speaking, to isolate or to emphasize these muscles that cross multiple joints, we have to take into account the positions of both joints that those muscles cross. That's a very good point. I will say the coffee here in Arizona is not as strong as the coffee we're used to, and I'll get over it for first world problems. Great questions, guys. Keep it coming.
Will you have any questions, addressing the transverse abdominis in any way? If so, what would that look like?
Yeah, what a great question. If I did ask a transverse abdominis question, it's that it has no movement function, right? So in other words, a couple ways I can sneak it in there is if I do right or left transverse rotation and I put agonistic muscles and I pop in the transverse abdominis as an option, you need to know that. I'm not gonna put it, right. I might put right external, left internal, and transverse abdominis, or left external, right internal, and transverse abdominis. And you're like, oh no, that transverse abdominis is our trunk sphincter muscle. It compresses, it creates interthecal pressure. It goes from vertebra all the way out to vertebra. So it's not anchored on one end to move at the other. It's just literally doing this so that we could create rigid links, interthecal pressure, lumbar stabilization, but it's not actively involved in specific joint motions because it cancels out. Whatever's trying to spin me to the right is canceled out by the other part that's trying to spin me to the left. So I think the indirect way of knowing that is to not put it as an answer if I ask you about agonistic movement questions. Does that make sense? Great question.
Yeah, that's it.
So do first class levels have like a basic quality, and then the other two are more specialized towards the forces to be
Repeat that one time.
like first class levels, they have like balance, force, speed, and change direction. And the other two are more specialized, so our first class levels is more balance,
Yeah, first class levers are gonna be more balanced, than the other two. Um, did you hear the question,
Yeah,
Dr.
did you
Campbell?
hear it?
Do
'Cause
you
we-
mind repeating it?
So he was asking, like, first class level levers have all these functions,
Mhm.
and then has one function, third class has another.
Yeah.
He was wanting
Advantages.
like a combination of all three of them, or like what would you consider something that's all three?
No problem. So one of the reasons the first class can do all four functions of a simple machine is because the axis is in between whatever two other forces are trying to influence motion. For us, it's external forces versus internal forces, right? Our muscles versus a resistance. So what that means is that if my axis is here, I can use different forces. Sometimes it's my muscles, right? And we just did the inverters and everters to help balance when the axis is in between. The redirection of an applied force happens in a first class because if I push down on one end, the other end goes up. If I push down on the other end, that part goes up. So that's advantageous. I think one of the examples we use is our cervical. I look up not because I have muscles pulling my head up, but I look up because I have cervical extensors like the erector spinae pulling the base of my skull down. It's an advantage of having a first class arrangement. A first class can do amplify force, but at the detriment of speed. So you think of the classic example of lifting a boulder, right? So like I'm pushing down on one end that has a big, long moment arm, and the other end is going to lift the heavy boulder. Let me use my coffee mug as an example, right? But it won't lift the boulder fast, but it's going to move it. And that's the whole point. Like I just need to get the boulder moved. I don't need to make it go fast. And then the other extreme is if I have the axis closer on this end, I can create super fast motion on the other end. First class levers cannot do all of that at the same time. You got to pick your poison. Do you want slow and strong, or do you want fast and not as strong? Not that it's not as strong, but the resistance has to be light. Like when we're going fast, I can't have heavy stuff. So what I've always said is that I'm going to emphasize on the first, because the first can be confusing because it can emphasize speed, it can emphasize force. So that's why I've emphasized the first classes balance and redirection, and thirds favor speed, and seconds favor torque or force at the detriment of speed. And the reason that happens is because if you have an axis here and you have a resistance here, and you have your muscle force here, that's like the wheelbarrow, right? You could lift heavy stuff, but you got to do it slow. So when the forces are far away, when muscles cross and insert far away, they can slow down movement in the opposite direction or help lift heavy things, but they're not going to do it fast. And if you think about doing like a max, you're not going to do that fast. If you're doing strenuous lifts, you're not going to do that fast. But I also try to teach you that when you're doing heavy stuff, it doesn't matter if it's a second or a third. You want to ask any muscle to help, right? Because that little bit, I think we use in class, like the example of a spot. If you're doing a max bench and you're struggling, it doesn't take a huge amount of force from your spotter to help lift it up. It could take one finger. It could just take a little bit to help get that motion. So when we're doing strenuous things, we want to use muscles that have first, second, third. It doesn't matter because we want as much help as possible to help move that heavy thing. However, when we're going fast, we can't recruit second class. We can't recruit first that have the advantage of force because those muscles can't contract fast enough to run with us. It's the example of Usain Bolt can choose to jog and go slow, but I can't choose to run fast like Usain Bolt. So third class muscles that insert close to the axis, that are going to have short contraction distance, but huge sweeping ranges of motion on the other end, like the iliopsoas, only has to contract a little bit and the hip is going to flex a lot. So to summarize all of that, when we're doing heavy, strenuous things, we want to use any and all muscles that have any and all leverage, because we need all hands on deck. We need anybody that can help us, because any of that help is going to be the difference between moving it and not. But when we're sprinting, when we're moving things fast, we're only going to rely on first classes that have the advantage of speed, or third classes that always have the advantage of speed. That is the so what at this level of undergraduate biomechanics, is just to understand the advantages of leverage and the trade-offs between, I think I used the example of trying to get a lug nut off of a tire, where you want a long metal pipe or wrench, and when you finally overcome, it's not rotating fast. In fact, you got to it's like, man, how much longer do I have to? And then finally, when it loosens it up, you take the wrench off and then you just spin it with your finger because it's close to the axis. So that's the essence. First class can do all four. Great. Really in the body, balance, redirection is our biggest advantage. You have some muscles that insert very close to the axis. They're going to have an advantage of speed and range of motion, but they can't do heavy things. Lucky for us, when we're trying to go fast, it can't be heavy. You can't have heavy things and go fast. So thirds are going to be used when we're sprinting, when we're throwing, when we're doing fast things. When you're doing something heavy, something that involves a lot of force, you're going to use seconds. But why wouldn't you use firsts and thirds? Anybody that can help me move it, any extra little juice you can get, all hands on deck. So when you're doing heavy things, the seconds might be doing a majority of that work, but it's going to be any muscle that has any lever arrangement, because we need all hands on deck to do that heavy lifting. Is that a good summary?
Yeah. Thank you, Doctor.
I think I gave the practical example when you're not loaded, and I don't mean like that, right? Like when you don't have an external force that's heavy or slow, and you flex your knee as fast as possible, your gastrocnemius stays quiet. It's a knee flexor, but when you flex the knee fast, it can't keep up with your hamstrings, because your hamstrings are pulling very close to the axis of the knee, and the gastrocnemius crosses the knee and then goes all the way down to your heel. So that's just an example of a second class advantage muscle that's like, I can't keep up with you. I can't run fast enough to keep up with you. So I'm just going to stay out. I'm just going to be silent. Good question. So remember, I think I've said several times with the lever stuff, it's going to be advantage. Like I'm going to specifically highlight, I'm trying to do this. I'm trying to do that. The key words will be in the question for the advantage. My erector spinae pulled the base of my skull down so that I can look up. It'll have those key words in the question. There's a big cactus right outside my window, and I don't know what to make of that. That's interesting. We don't have that in Delcom. We got crawfish mounds. Is that it? Like I always say, if you're done with me, I'm done with you. I think it's fair to say that a majority of our questions are going to be functional questions, right? This muscle is this muscle is a function. How does it pull? So that's going to be a majority of our questions. And then we're going to incorporate the agonist muscle with a contraction for practical examples. We'll have some exercises. I'll have some stretching questions. I'm going to try to have a good mix. You don't have to worry about 30 lever questions is what I'm trying to get to. We good?
Think so, okay. Y'all are good to
All right,
go.
guys. Yeah, have a good one. Thank you, Emma and Grace.